black female, dark jacket, large handbag, keeping eyes on her over. Those words crackled through Brandon Webb's radio like they were the most natural thing in the world to say, like describing a storm rolling in or a car parked in the wrong spot, like the color of a woman's skin was information that needed to be transmitted and tracked and filed away as a warning. And not one single person on the other end of that radio questioned it. Not one voice came back to ask, why not? One person said, wait, what did she actually do? Because in that mall on that afternoon, in that particular stretch of polished marble corridor with its warm weekend light and its cheerful window displays, the answer to that question apparently didn't matter yet. The woman those words described was walking 30 feet below the mezzanine where Brandon stood with his radio still pressed to his lips, and she had no idea any of it was happening because she was looking down at the small hand wrapped around hers. The fingers of her 9-year-old niece Lily, who was practically skipping with excitement as they moved through the crowd together, and Lily was saying something about the jewelry store near the fountain. The one with the star-shaped pendants in the window, the one she'd been talking about for 2 weeks straight, and the woman holding her hand, Captain Diane Washington of the 12th Precinct. 20 years on the force badge folded quietly in the left pocket of her jeans, was smiling because this was exactly what she had needed today. Exactly this. A child's uncomplicated joy pulling her forward into something that had nothing to do with case files or disciplinary hearings, or the particular weight that came from spending 14 hours inside a building where everything was a problem to be solved. She had earned this afternoon. The mall was alive in the way that only weekend afternoons can produce strollers and shopping bags and couples moving at the slow, unhurried pace of people who had nowhere urgent to be. The smell of cinnamon from a bakery. 2 storefronts down, mixing with something floral from a candle display near the entrance, and underneath all of it, the low, pleasant hum of a world that felt on the surface entirely harmless and entirely ordinary. Diane had finished her shift at 6 that morning after a night that included 2 domestic calls, a traffic fatality report that would need 3 rewrites before it was acceptable, and a conversation with a junior officer she was mentoring that had gone 45 minutes longer than scheduled because he needed someone to talk him through something he wasn't ready to put in writing yet. And by the time she had changed out of her uniform and driven to her sister's house to pick up Lily, she had been awake for 22 hours straight. And the only thing that had kept her from going straight home to sleep was the memory of Lily's face the last time she had promised something, and then canceled that particular brand of quiet, uncomplaining disappointment that children do so much better than adults because they haven't yet learned to hide it. So here she was, off duty, no uniform badge in her pocket, out of habit more than intention, holding the hand of a child who was currently explaining in great detail why the star pendant was better than the butterfly pendant. Because stars were permanent and butterflies only lasted a summer, and Diane was thinking that 9-year-olds understood more about the world than most people gave them credit for. She felt them before she saw them. 20 years of instinct don't turn off when you change your clothes, and the particular quality of attention that Brandon Webb and Ryan Moss were directing at her from the mezzanine above had a texture she recognized immediately. Not the casual glance of bored security guards watching a crowd, but something focused and deliberate, and already decided the kind of attention that had already written its conclusion before gathering its evidence. And Diane felt the familiar tightening across her shoulders that she had felt in grocery stores and parking garages and hotel lobbies her entire adult life, the sensation of being seen as a problem before being seen as a person. She exhaled slowly through her nose and tightened her grip on Lily's hand just slightly, not enough for the child to notice, just enough to ground herself, and kept walking toward the jewelry store because she had promised Lily a star pendant, and she was not going to let 2 men with radios and assumptions take this afternoon from them. The boutique called itself Lux and Grace, and it had clearly invested heavily in the luxe portion of that promise, warm amber lighting that made every piece of silver and gold glow like it was lit from within. Glass cases that were polished to absolute clarity. Soft jazz playing at exactly the volume that said, "You should feel lucky to be here," And at the center of it all, behind the main counter, stood Donna Pierce, whose platinum blonde hair was pulled back with the kind of precision that suggested she approached her appearance the same way she approached her store as a controlled environment, where everything had its designated place, and anything that didn't belong was a disruption to be managed. Donna's smile arrived on her face approximately 1 second after her eyes registered Diane and Lily stepping through the door, and it was the kind of smile that had been practiced often enough to look real from a distance, but had a tightness at the corners that Diane, who had spent 2 decades reading people in interrogation rooms, clocked immediately. Lily had no such complications in her reaction to the store and rushed directly to the display case nearest the window, pressing her nose almost against the glass, her breath fogging it slightly as she pointed at the silver star pendant that had apparently been living rent-free in her imagination for 2 weeks, turning to Diane with the specific expression of a child who has just confirmed that the real thing is even better than the picture she saw online. Diane smiled and moved toward her. And that was when she noticed Donna begin to follow, not walking toward them to help the way a good salesperson would, but tracking them, maintaining a distance that felt less like customer service and more like supervision, her eyes moving from Diane's face to the large leather handbag at Diane's side with a regularity that was impossible to miss. Diane asked to see the pendant, and Donna unlocked the case with hands that weren't entirely steady, placing it on the counter velvet with a small click before relocking the cabinet. Immediately, a reflex quick and unconscious, like someone protecting what was theirs from someone they'd already decided couldn't be trusted. And Lily leaned over the counter to look at it with her whole entire heart, while Donna's gaze continued its restless circuit between Diane's face and Diane's bag. Then Lily looked up at Donna with the open, unguarded curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned that some questions make adults uncomfortable, and she asked in the most innocent voice imaginable why the lady at the counter kept looking at her D's purse instead of looking at the necklace. The jazz kept playing. Nobody answered. And from the doorway, Brandon Webb stepped inside. Donna Pierce didn't lower her voice when she made the announcement, and that was the thing Diane would remember most clearly afterward. Not the words themselves, which were predictable enough, but the volume, the almost theatrical projection of them across a boutique that suddenly had the absolute attention of every person inside it, as though Donna had decided that if she was going to do this, she was going to do it with enough witnesses to make retreat impossible for everyone involved. A piece from the front display, Donna said, was missing, and she had seen her eyes landing on Diane's bag with the weight of a verdict already rendered. She had seen it go into that purse. The 2 other customers in the store, a middle-aged couple who had been quietly examining earrings in the far corner, turned around in the specific way that people do when they're trying to look like they're not watching something they are absolutely watching. And Brandon Webb stepped forward from the doorway with the posture of a man who had been waiting for exactly this invitation, his hand going to his radio with a practiced ease that suggested this was not the first time he had played this particular role. He asked, "Diane told Diane really the question mark somewhere," absent from his tone to open her bag and empty the contents onto the counter. Diane felt the heat move through her chest in a wave she had learned over decades of professional necessity to let pass through her without letting it out. And she straightened her shoulders and looked at Brandon with the steady, unblinking regard of someone who had faced considerably more intimidating situations than a boutique security guard with a radio and a wrong assumption, and she said clearly and without any tremor in her voice whatsoever that she had touched nothing in this store except the pendant that Donna had placed on the counter herself, and that there was no probable cause for a search of her personal belongings, and that she would not be complying. Lily had gone very still beside her. The child wasn't looking at Donna or Brandon. She was looking at Diane, watching her D's face with the particular attentiveness of a child who is trying to read a situation through the expressions of the adult. She trusts most, trying to understand from the set of Diane's jaw and the steadiness of Diane's eyes, whether this was something to be afraid of or something that was going to be okay. and Diane glanced down at her for just a fraction of a second, just long enough to communicate. "I'm here." Stay close before returning her gaze to Brandon, who had already lifted his radio and was calling for Ryan Moss to come to the front. In the corner of the boutique, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and the upright posture of someone who had spent 40 years standing at the front of lecture halls set down the bracelet she'd been examining and turned around with an expression of measured, experienced attention, watching everything with the calm precision of someone who understood exactly what she was witnessing and was already organizing it in her mind. This was Professor Eleanor Briggs, and she had seen enough in her career to know that the next few minutes were going to matter. Ryan Moss came through the door and positioned himself to Diane's left, with the mechanical reliability of someone following a script he'd internalized so thoroughly he'd stopped questioning it. And now there were 2 security guards flanking the entrance, and Donna Pierce behind the counter, and the pendant still sitting on its velvet square, like the whole ridiculous performance had been staged around a 2-inch piece of jewelry. And Diane stood in the middle of all of it with her hands loose at her sides, and her voice absolutely level, and her mind doing the thing it had been trained to do, cataloging exits, cataloging witnesses, cataloging the position of every phone in the room. She asked again directly and formally for Donna to review the security camera footage from the past 10 minutes, which would resolve the matter immediately and conclusively. And Donna said in a tone that managed to be simultaneously defensive and dismissive that camera access required the mall's head of security, and she couldn't just pull it up on request. Ryan Moss was not meeting her eyes, and Diane noticed the way he kept his gaze slightly to her left. The particular quality of his discomfort, the way his hands kept moving to adjust his radio without any actual purpose. And she recognized what she was seeing, because she had watched it in junior officers before. A man who wasn't certain he was doing the right thing, but who had decided for reasons of convenience or deference or simple cowardice to keep doing it anyway. And beneath the professional calm, beneath the measured voice, and the catalogued exits, and the training that had made her very good at being composed in unreasonable situations, Diane was feeling something that no amount of training had ever fully prepared her for. Not fear of Brandon or Donna or whatever came next, but a slow, spreading ache that came from the particular cruelty of the moment she was standing in, because Lily was 9 years old, and Lily was watching all of this, and every choice Diane made in the next few minutes was going to teach her niece something about the world that Diane would give almost anything not to have to teach her today. She reached down and found Lily's hand. Lily squeezed back immediately without hesitation with both of hers, and Diane felt something move through her that wasn't calm and wasn't strategy, but was the thing that had always been underneath both of those things. The thing that had gotten her through 20 years of a profession that asked everything from her, and sometimes gave very little back, and she held on to it the same way Lily was holding on to her hand. Then the sound came from the corridor, heavy, unhurried footsteps that had a different quality than the general mall crowd, and Officer Troy Harmon appeared in the boutique doorway. He was tall and broad-shouldered with close-cropped blonde hair, and the particular way of holding himself that Diane had seen many times before in many different contexts. The stance of someone who had decided somewhere along the way that their presence in a room was itself a form of authority, that the physical fact of their arrival was supposed to settle whatever had been unsettled before they got there, and who had been right about that often enough that they had stopped questioning whether they might someday be wrong. Troy Harmon scanned the boutique in approximately 3 seconds, his eyes moving from Donna Pierce, white, distressed, clearly the one who'd made the call, to Brandon and Ryan, security flanking to Diane Black. Large bag, not complying. And Diane, who had spent 20 years reading exactly this kind of rapid visual assessment in exactly this kind of context, watched the decision form in his eyes before he had opened his mouth to speak, and understood that for Troy Harmon, the situation had already been resolved in the moment he'd registered the basic geometry of the room. He told Diane without asking her name, Without asking Donna what specifically had happened, without directing a single question at Brandon or Ryan that she needed to step outside with him so they could sort this out, Diane responded with the same patient clarity she'd maintained since this began. She identified herself as a law enforcement professional. She stated that she had documentation on her person. She requested that he verify the security footage before making any further determinations. And she said all of this in a voice that was quiet enough that Lily, standing at her side, had to lean in slightly to hear it. Troy smiled, and it was the specific smile of a man who had heard some version of this before, and found it unconvincing. The smile of someone who believed that the authority of their badge was non-negotiable, and that anyone pushing back against it was either confused about how the world worked or actively making a bad decision, and he told her that if she really was who she said she was, they could verify it outside, and if she cooperated, this would be over in 5 minutes. Lily looked up at Troy Harmon with 9 years' worth of unclouded, unfiltered perception, and she asked him in the small, genuine voice of a child who truly wants to understand something, why he was asking her D to prove she belonged here when nobody had asked the other people in the store to prove anything at all. The jazz kept playing. Troy did not answer. And in the corner, Professor Eleanor Briggs picked up her phone. What happened next took less than 30 seconds, and it happened fast enough that the details only fully assembled themselves in Diane's memory later. The way Troy's expression shifted from performed patience to something harder and more decided when she didn't immediately move toward the door, the way his hand came up and found her shoulder with a force that communicated not urgency, but a particular kind of message. The specific message that said, "This conversation is over, and I am the one ending it." And then the cold, flat surface of the boutique's glass wall was against her cheek, and the display cases were rattling. And somewhere behind her, Lily made a sound that Diane had never heard her make before, and would not forget for the rest of her life. The cuffs went on too tight. She felt it immediately, the way the metal bit at the wrong angle, the kind of restraint that wasn't about security but about something else, about making a point about the specific language of force that said you thought you could resist this and look where that got you. And she did not cry out, because she had learned too young that crying out sometimes made things worse and sometimes made things more interesting for the wrong people. And so she breathed slowly and deliberately through the pressure in her wrists and the cold against her face, and the knowledge that there were at least 6 phones in this boutique recording every second. She raised her voice not in panic, not in anger, but in the steady, carrying tone of someone making a record. And she said clearly enough that every microphone in the room could capture it, that this was excessive force, that she had not resisted arrest, that she had not threatened anyone, and that every person in this room was a witness to the use of physical restraint in the absence of any legitimate justification for it. And underneath all of that, underneath the training and the professional vocabulary and the practiced composure, something else was happening. Something that Diane had never encountered in 20 years of working within a system she had sometimes loved, and sometimes fought, and always tried to make better from the inside, because she was standing in the middle of a boutique with her cheek against a glass wall and metal on her wrists. And for the first time in 2 decades, she was on the other side of what she had dedicated her career to preventing, and the distance between what she knew intellectually about this experience and what it actually felt like to be inside it was so vast and so devastating that she had to close her eyes for a single second just to stay present inside her own body. 20 years. And it still felt like this. Near the door, an older man who had been browsing quietly near the tie display, who had in fact been recording on his phone since the moment Troy walked in, stood with his arm extended and his phone absolutely steady, not hiding what he was doing, making deliberate eye contact with Troy Harmon in a way that said, "I see you, and I am not putting this down." And Troy either didn't notice or didn't care. And Eleanor Briggs had moved from her corner to a position near the counter where she could see everything. And she had said Troy's name once clearly and requested that he stop and check the woman's identification. And Troy had looked at her the way certain kinds of people look at obstacles they've decided to go around, rather than engage with. Troy pulled Diane toward the door, and Lily moved. Not the way a frightened child runs, not scrambling or crying or grabbing blindly, but with the specific, deliberate intention of someone who has decided that they are not going to stand where they are standing and watch what is happening in front of them without doing something about it. And she caught the hem of Diane's jacket with both hands and held on with a grip that was for a 9-year-old remarkable. Diane turned her head as far as the restraint allowed and spoke to Lily in the quietest, most carefully controlled voice she could produce, telling her it was okay, telling her to stay where she was, telling her that everything was going to be all right in the specific tone that adults use when they need a child to believe something before they entirely believe it themselves. And Lily looked at her Dee's face with those dark, clear 9-year-old eyes, and then she let go of the jacket, and she turned to Troy Harmon. She didn't shout at him, she didn't accuse him, she didn't do any of the things that adults in this situation might have done. She just looked at him with the full, unguarded, unmediated attention of a child who has not yet learned that some truths are impolite to say out loud. And she asked him in a voice that was small and genuine and absolutely without any performance in it at all, whether the police were supposed to protect people. And if they were, then why was he hurting her, Dee? The boutique went completely silent. Not the hush of discomfort, not the polite silence of people pretending not to watch something, but the real silence. The kind that happens when something has been said that cuts through every layer of adult justification and procedural language, and reaches the thing underneath that everyone actually knows is true. And even Troy Harmon, who had spent the past several minutes operating with the momentum of someone who had decided this situation was already handled, paused for a fraction of a second in which something moved across his face that wasn't quite an expression but was the shadow of one, a flicker of something that might have been the beginning of doubt if he had let it be. He didn't let it be. But the pause was there, and the 6 phones in the room captured it, and the older man near the tie display captured it, and Eleanor Briggs looked at Lily Washington with the expression of someone who has just witnessed something she is going to remember for the rest of her life. Troy pushed through the boutique door and out into the mall corridor, and the crowd that had gathered in the past several minutes, because people always know when something is happening in a mall. The particular shifting of foot traffic that precedes a scene turned and saw a black woman in handcuffs being walked through Maple Ridge Mall on a Saturday afternoon, and the phones that hadn't been recording started recording, and the ones that were already recording zoomed in. And somewhere in the crowd a woman said, "That's not right," in the kind of voice that isn't looking for agreement, but is simply stating a fact that has become impossible not to state out loud. Before we go further, if you believe what you just watched happen to this woman is something that happens far too often and far too quietly, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, because the only way these stories create change is if enough people refuse to look away. Drop in the comments where you're watching from. We want to know. Now let's see what happens next. Diane stopped walking. Not a stumble, not a struggle. A deliberate, planted stop, the kind that takes a very specific quality of physical presence and self-possession to execute, while your hands are restrained behind your back and a uniformed officer is pulling you through a public corridor with 200 people watching. And she turned her head toward the crowd, and she spoke with the carrying clarity of someone who had spent 20 years making herself heard in situations where being heard was the difference between justice and its absence. She said her name. She said her rank. She said her precinct. She said that her badge and identification were in the left front pocket of her jeans, and that anyone who wanted to verify her identity could do so in the next 30 seconds if the officer in custody of her would simply stop walking and allow it. Troy Harmon laughed a short dismissive sound that he directed at the crowd rather than at Diane, like he was sharing a joke with them at her expense, and he said that claiming to be a police captain to avoid arrest was a crime in itself, and that she could add impersonating an officer to the list they were already working with, and he said it with the ease of someone who had reached without effort or examination the explanation that required him to change nothing about what he was doing. Several people in the crowd looked uncertain, Not unconvinced exactly, but unsettled the way people look when a narrative they're being offered doesn't quite fit the evidence in front of them. And from somewhere in the back of the gathering, the clear, unhurried voice of Eleanor Briggs said that she was a professor of criminal law at Northfield University, that she had witnessed this entire incident from its beginning inside the boutique, and that she was formally and publicly requesting that Officer Harmon examine the woman's identification before taking another step. Troy kept walking, and that was when the sound came from the far end of the corridor. The crowd heard him before they saw him, or rather they felt the shift in the air that his approach created the way people at the edges of the gathering began turning. Not because they'd heard something alarming, but because they sensed something authoritative moving toward them. And the sea of shoppers and phone cameras parted without anyone consciously deciding to part the way crowds do for people who carry a certain kind of presence. Not performed authority, but the real kind. The kind that comes from 30 years of showing up and doing the job the way the job was supposed to be done. Sergeant Victor Lawson was in his mid-50s with the deliberate walk of a man who had long ago stopped proving anything to anyone. His face carrying the particular kind of steadiness that comes not from having never been angry, but from having learned to locate his anger somewhere useful rather than somewhere destructive. And when he saw Diane Washington in handcuffs in the middle of Maple Ridge Mall, his expression did not collapse into shock or outrage. It simply set the way metal sets when it cools, becoming harder and more exact in its shape. He stopped in front of Troy Harmon. He did not raise his voice. He looked at Troy with the full weight of 3 decades on the force, and he asked him in a tone that had no question in it despite its grammatical form to explain the situation. Troy began the explanation theft complaint, non-compliance refusal to show identification, and Victor listened to approximately 45 seconds of it before he interrupted with a quiet precision that was somehow more forceful than any raised voice could have been. He said Diane's full name, her rank, and her precinct in a single sentence the way you state a fact that has always been a fact, and that no amount of misunderstanding has the power to change. And then he said something that the crowd had not been expecting, and that Troy Harmon clearly, visibly had not been expecting. Either he said that Captain Diane Washington was the officer leading the 12th Precinct's internal review of use-of-force incidents across the district, a review that had already resulted in the formal investigation of 4 officers, and that Troy Harmon's name was among those whose conduct was currently being evaluated within that review. The corridor went very quiet. Troy's face did a complicated series of things in rapid succession. The initial reflexive rejection of the information, the second layer. Where the information began to land, the third layer. Where the implications of the information assembled themselves into something he couldn't reorganize into a comfortable shape. And Diane watched all 3 of those layers move across his face with the calm of someone who has delivered difficult information to difficult people many times and knows that the moment after delivery is the one that matters most. Victor turned to Troy and told him without heat and without any particular dramatic emphasis to remove the restraints. Troy's hands were not steady when he reached for the key, and the crowd noticed this in the way crowds notice everything collectively without discussion in the particular silence that gathers around a moment that everyone present understands is significant and irreversible. The cuffs came off. Diane brought her hands around and looked at her wrists for a moment at the marks the metal had left red and precise, the kind of evidence that doesn't need a caption. And then she reached into the left front pocket of her jeans and removed her badge and her identification and held them out to Troy Harmon. Not as a gesture of victory, but as a simple act of completion, as though this was always how this was going to end and she had simply been waiting for everyone else to catch up to that fact. Troy looked at them. He looked at them for what felt to everyone watching like a long time. Eleanor Briggs had moved to stand beside Diane, and now she turned to address the crowd with the practiced clarity of someone who had spent 4 decades making complex things understandable to rooms full of people. And she said that she had been present inside the boutique from the beginning of this incident, and was prepared to provide a full account of everything she had witnessed to any investigating authority and that in her professional assessment, what had occurred inside that boutique constituted racial profiling, unlawful detention, and the use of excessive physical force against a uniformed law enforcement officer who had identified herself clearly and repeatedly. The man who had been recording since the beginning lowered his phone for the first time and stepped toward Diane, and he introduced himself as a reporter for the Northfield Tribune. He had been at the mall working on a piece about weekend retail security practices, which now seemed considerably less interesting than what had just fallen into his lap, and he asked Diane if she would be willing to speak on the record. Donna Pierce, watching from the boutique entrance, took a slow step backward into the store. Victor Lawson's phone rang. He looked at the screen and something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the recognition of an inevitability arriving on schedule, and he answered it with 2 words, and then listened for approximately 20 seconds, his eyes on Troy Harmon the entire time. And then he held the phone out to Troy and told him that the deputy chief of police would like to speak with him. The video that the man near the tie display had been recording had found its way through the particular velocity of shared outrage to a local news feed within the past 8 minutes, and the deputy chief had been watching it from his office on the other side of the city with the specific expression of a man watching a subordinate create a problem that was now going to require significant institutional energy to address. And the words he was saying to Troy Harmon, through that phone, were words that Troy was receiving in the total absolute privacy of his own comprehension, while 200 people watched his face and understood without being able to hear a syllable exactly what was being communicated. Troy's hand holding the phone to his ear was completely still. His face had lost the particular quality of performed confidence that had carried him through the past 40 minutes, and what remained underneath it was something that looked stripped of its scaffolding, considerably less certain of itself. Not a monster, not a cartoon, but a man who had built so many layers of unexamined habit and untested assumption on top of himself that he had stopped being able to see what was underneath, and who was now in the most public and unforgiving possible setting, being asked to look. Lily Washington, standing at Diane's side, with Diane's hand now wrapped around hers again, watched Troy Harmon listen to that phone call with the clear, patient eyes of a child who is learning something about the world that she will carry with her for a very long time. She didn't look triumphant. She looked like she was trying to understand. Diane Washington stood in the middle of Maple Ridge Mall's main corridor, with her badge in her hand, and 200 people watching her, and she made a choice that she had not planned to make when she walked into this mall this afternoon, holding Lily's hand and thinking about cinnamon rolls and star-shaped pendants she chose not to leave. She could have left, and nobody would have blamed her, and a part of her, the part that was tired, deeply, and specifically tired in the way that only people who have spent a long time fighting for something from inside the system that needs fighting, understand that part, wanted nothing more than to take Lily's hand and walk out through those glass doors and let the institutional machinery handle what came next from a safe, quiet distance. But she stayed. She turned to face the crowd that had gathered around her. The shoppers with their phones still raised, the families who had stopped mid-errand to witness something they couldn't entirely name, but knew was important. The store employees peering from doorways. Eleanor Briggs standing straight-backed at the edge of the gathering. Victor Lawson a few feet behind her with the patient, watchful stillness of a man who understood what this moment required of him, and she spoke. She did not speak as a victim, and she did not perform rage for the cameras because she had learned over 2 decades that performed rage. However justified becomes the story, and the story she needed people to hear was not about her anger, but about the structure that had made this afternoon possible. The layers of assumption and habit and unchallenged reflex that had been built into certain people's understanding of who belonged, where, and who needed to prove. It built so deep and so early that it operated without examination, which was precisely what made it so durable and so damaging and so completely invisible to the people it most benefited. She talked about Donna Pierce not to condemn her as an individual, but to name what her behavior had been, the way her eyes had moved to Diane's bag before Diane had touched a single item, the way her decision had been made before the question was even asked, and Diane said it plainly and without cruelty, that this was not about malice. That malice was almost easier to address than this, that what was harder, what required actual sustained effort to change, was the kind of bias that wears the clothing of caution and calls itself good judgment. She looked at Brandon Webb and Ryan Moss, who were standing very still near the boutique entrance, with the expressions of men who had not fully anticipated arriving here when they picked up their radios this morning. And she said something that wasn't an accusation, but was in some ways harder than one. She said that the choice to follow, without questioning, to execute a directive because it came from someone with more institutional authority was still a choice, and that it had consequences for the people it fell on that didn't get lighter just because the person executing the directive was following orders. And then she looked at Troy Harmon. She held his gaze for a moment that lasted long enough for everyone watching to understand it was intentional, and what she said to him was not what most people in that crowd probably expected her to say, which was perhaps why it landed the way it did. She said that she didn't believe he had woken up this morning intending to do what he had done, and that she believed that somewhere in him was a version of the person who had chosen this profession for the reasons people are supposed to choose it, and that what she needed from him, what this moment required from him, not as an officer, but as a human being who had just looked at another human being and chosen incorrectly, was not a performance of remorse, but an honest examination of the machinery inside himself that had made today feel reasonable. She said it was hard to see that machinery from the inside. She said she knew that because she carried her own machinery that she had to examine regularly and with difficulty. And she said that the measure of whether any of this meant anything was not what got said in public today, but what got done in private tomorrow. Troy Harmon looked at her and didn't speak, and the crowd was absolutely quiet. Lily, who had been listening to all of this with the particular focused intensity of a child who understands she is witnessing something important, reached up and put her small hand in Diane's and leaned against her arm, and Diane felt her niece's weight against her side, and looked down at her for a moment and thought about all the things she hadn't wanted to teach this child today, and all the things she apparently had no choice but to teach her anyway, and she put her arm around Lily's shoulders and held her close. Sandra Cole, Maple Ridge Mall's Director of Public Relations, navigated through the gathered crowd with the specific velocity of a woman who understood with mathematical clarity that every additional second she spent, not being physically present in this situation, was a second that would cost the organization money and credibility in roughly equal measure. And she arrived at Diane's side with an outstretched hand, and the beginnings of a sentence that contained the words on behalf of, and deeply, and commitment to, before Diane. With a gentle precision that had nothing impolite in it, redirected her. She told Sandra that she appreciated the mall's response, and that what she needed from the institution was not language, but action, and that the specific action she needed was for every second of security footage from every camera that had a sightline to the Lux and Grace boutique in the past 2 hours to be preserved immediately and turned over to the investigating authority without editing or delay, and that this was not a request. Sandra's hand dropped back to her side, and she produced a phone from her jacket and began making calls. The video had been spreading for 11 minutes when the first counter-narrative appeared in the comment section's accounts that had been created recently, posting similar language suggesting that the woman had been behaving erratically and that the officer had no choice but to respond as he did, the kind of coordinated pushback that emerges so predictably and so quickly in situations like this that its appearance is itself a form of information, and Diane watching it develop from her phone, while Victor Lawson handled the logistics of what came next, understood with the bone-deep clarity of someone who had navigated this landscape before that the work was not ending here, that this afternoon was not a conclusion but a beginning, and that the only reason she had any power to shape what came next was precisely because she had not walked away. The camera footage, when it was pulled from the mall's main security system, not the boutique's own cameras, which would have required Donna Pierce's cooperation, but the mall's independent overhead system that captured the full length of the corridor and the boutique's entrance, showed Diane and Lily entering the store, showed every moment of what happened inside through the glass front wall, and showed with the unambiguous clarity of a wide-angle lens that had no interest in anyone's version of events that Diane had touched nothing in that store except the pendant Donna had placed on the counter, and that Donna had begun moving toward her bag before the pendant had even been fully removed from the case. By the time Troy Harmon was escorted to his vehicle by Victor Lawson and 2 other officers, the footage had been sent to 3 separate news desks. The mall parking lot was quieter than the corridor had been, and Troy Harmon sat in the front seat of his patrol car after the others had left and looked at his phone screen where the video was still playing on a loop on the news feed, and he watched himself do what he had done from the perspective of a camera that had been too far away to hear what was being said, but close enough to show exactly how his body had moved and exactly what his face had looked like while it was moving that way. He had seen videos like this before, and he had watched them the way certain people watch those videos, with the reflexive self-protective analysis of someone searching for the detail that justified the frame that complicated the angle that offered an alternative interpretation. But that mechanism wasn't working for him right now, because he had been there and he knew what he had been thinking. And the thinking and the video were saying exactly the same thing. He thought about Lily Washington asking him why he was hurting her aunt. He had not answered her, and he had not answered her because somewhere in the register where his brain processed questions that one had arrived and found nothing useful to process against. No procedure, no protocol, no line in any training manual he had ever read that addressed the specific question a 9-year-old was actually asking him, which was not about policy, but about something much simpler and much harder, which was whether he saw the person in front of him as a person. He had been taught many things in 22 years of life and 6 years on the force, and the teaching had been so consistent and so ambient and so embedded in the texture of the institutions he'd moved through that he had absorbed most of it without ever consciously deciding to absorb it. And somewhere in that accumulated, unexamined inheritance was the particular reflex that had fired this afternoon, and he was sitting in a parking lot in the early evening realizing for what he understood with an uncomfortable clarity was the first time that he had never once stopped to look at it. He put his phone face down on the passenger seat. He sat with that for a long time, and then slowly he reached for the notepad he kept in his center console, the one where he sometimes wrote notes to himself about things he needed to follow up on, and he wrote 3 words that were not for anyone else, that would not appear in any report or statement or public accounting of this afternoon, that were just for him and the version of himself he was going to have to decide what to do with. He wrote, "What did I miss?" Officer Troy Harmon was suspended with pay pending a formal investigation that concluded 3 months later in a mandatory 18-month retraining program focused on de-escalation and bias awareness, a program that Diane Washington did not design but agreed after a conversation with Victor Lawson that lasted 2 hours and covered considerably more ground than the Maple Ridge incident to consult on, because she believed that the purpose of accountability was to build something better and not simply to burn down what had failed, and because 18 months was enough time if a person was genuinely willing to begin the work of looking clearly at the machinery inside themselves. Brandon Webb and Ryan Moss lost their security contracts within 48 hours of the mall completing its internal review, the footage from the overhead cameras having removed any ambiguity from the question of whether their conduct had been justified. Donna Pierce submitted her resignation the same afternoon the camera footage was shared with the boutique's parent company before the termination conversation she had been scheduled to have the following morning could take place. Maple Ridge Mall's new anti-discrimination policy, developed in consultation with Eleanor Briggs and 2 civil rights organizations that reached out in the week following the incident, was published publicly and included for the first time in the mall's history a formal accountability mechanism for reporting and reviewing bias complaints from customers and staff alike. The reporter from the Northfield Tribune filed a story that ran above the fold on Monday, and was picked up by 14 outlets by Wednesday, and the footage, not the viral clip, but the full unedited mall security recording with its timestamp and its irrefutable wide-angle view, became part of the training curriculum in 2 law enforcement academies in the state, shown to incoming officers in the first week of their program, alongside the question that Diane had started using in her own training sessions, which was not "what are the rules," but "who are you protecting and do you actually see them?" 3 weeks after the afternoon that was supposed to be about a star-shaped pendant, Diane and Lily were sitting at Diane's kitchen table doing what they usually did when Lily came over, which was eating the specific brand of vanilla wafers that Lily had decided at age 4 was the only acceptable after-school snack. And Lily was wearing the necklace, because Diane had gone back to Lux and Grace the following week after the store had new management and a new policy, and a manager who looked her in the eye when she walked in and smiled like she meant it, and she had bought the pendant and had it wrapped and given it to Lily at Sunday dinner in front of the whole family, and Lily had put it on immediately and hadn't taken it off since. Lily looked at the necklace for a moment in the way she sometimes did when she was thinking something through, and then she looked up at Diane and asked her with the full seriousness of a child who wants a real answer, and will know if she isn't getting one. Why Diane still wanted to be a police officer, after everything that had happened. Diane looked at her niece at the star hanging at the base of her throat at the question sitting open and honest in her 9-year-old eyes, and she thought about the answer for long enough that Lily didn't rush her. Then she said, "Because you deserve someone in that uniform who sees you." The vanilla wafers sat between them on the table. Outside, the evening was coming in through the kitchen window, slow and ordinary, and entirely quietly beautiful. The badge that had been in Diane Washington's pocket the whole time through the boutique and the corridor and the cuffs and the crowd and every moment of that long unasked-for afternoon sat on the kitchen counter where she'd set it down when she got home, catching the last of the light. It had always been real. It had just taken everyone else a little longer to see it. If this story moved you, if you believe that dignity should never need proof and that the people who are supposed to protect us should see all of us, please like this video and subscribe to our channel, because these stories only reach the people who need them when enough of us decide they matter. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you had been standing in that mall today?